I will be very brief. Professor Server is on his way, either from State Department or as it comes here. There's always a dynamics of unprecedented events taking place. As you know, we just changed the Secretary of State this morning, so I guess he will be in here, and I have a privilege to welcome you on his behalf, on behalf of the Conflict Management Department here at SAIS Johns Hopkins, one of the, and I'll brag for about 10 seconds, the must-go think tank, a Center for Transatlantic Relations SAIS, and one of the most prominent universities in the world discussing international affairs. As you all know, we've done plenty of events on Egypt, and I think you can all consider this as your second home. And I love your country personally. I was there a number of times, and we're very much supportive of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and Hisham Fahmi's impeccable efforts here bringing two nations together. And so without further ado, since there's so many topics we will discuss, and my understanding is that the delegation will need to leave earlier, so the event will close up slightly early, maybe half an hour. I will give the floor to a colleague of mine, a fellow at the Center for Transatlantic Relations here at Johns Hopkins University, Andy Brenner.
Thank you, Sasha. Thank you all for being here. Thanks for the Egypt AmCham and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Thank you for the Center of Transatlantic Relations here at Johns Hopkins for hosting this event. We'd like to thank our panelists here for being here. Thank you all for agreeing to be a part of this discussion. My name is Andy Brainer. I work here with my fellow colleague, Dr. Sasha Toporek. I also work in the U.S. House of Representatives as a fellow international relations with Congressman Jeff Fortenberry. And he has graciously given me, he's giving me the job to animate the Egyptian caucus in the House of Representatives. And so I'm putting together some colleagues in the House where members will come together, where we have now 3 co-chairs of the Egyptian caucus, Representative Dana Rohrabacher from California, Representative Tulsi Gabbard from Hawaii, and Representative Jeff Fortenberry from the 1st District of Nebraska. And so there'll be more to come on that in the future. Again, thank you all for being here. At the risk of our time, I will just say that our distinguished panel here, we have the bios on this sheet that maybe you got coming in. So as I introduce them, you can get the full bio on your own, but I'll just do a brief overview. I think the best way to do this would be to introduce our panel and then to ask just sort of an opening question and have the panelists respond to that question, and then we'll get 5 to 10 minutes of an answer, and then we'll move on to the next panel. After about 20 minutes, I'll be watching the clock. After about 20 to 30 minutes, then we'll open the floor to questions and answers for you. And then if you've got any questions that you're sitting on that you would like to ask, we'll have a microphone around, and then we'll end here about say 3:25. We'll wrap up the discussion and be finished. So, onwards to what we came here for. Here in our discussion, I'd like to start by introducing Mr. Tawfik, the president of the AmCham Egypt and the vice chairman and managing director of the International Company for Agriculture Production and Processing. Since we're here to talk about Egypt's private sector in this challenging region, and as we watch what's happening in Egypt politically, economically, socially, culturally, I think it's important that we hear from experts like Tarek. So if you would, sir, down here on the end, if you could start us just with an understanding of how Egyptian industry is weathering the storm of a sluggish economy and how it's evolving from a macroeconomic standpoint.
Well, let me rephrase the question, how the Egyptian industry weathered the storm in a sluggish economy, which is not any more sluggish,
Very good.
So, I'd have to say that over the past 7 years, it was quite challenging, notably in 2015 and 2016 primarily. And the main issues that were impacting the Egyptian industries at large was availability of foreign currency, So there has been an interruption in the production cycle in view of not having currency to be able to import components, and that was very disruptive. Actually, energy blackouts at notably 2015 was a big issue. It interrupted the production cycle, and we've seen a decline from an industrial growth of 12.8% to minus 1.7% in 12-month period. So it was quite dramatic. Despite that, you know, I mean, I'd have to say that the production cycle, as much as it has been challenged, it weathered the storm at the time. So, but, you know, the breaking point that came after that has been the float of the Egyptian pound in November 2016. I'd have to say that the issue of currency has been settled once and for all. So the country is flush with dollars. We don't have any issues regarding transferability of currency, of importation, of, I mean, basically availing currency. So all the areas that the industry was, all the areas have been met and settled across the board. And maybe Ahmed will talk more about it, you know. Energy issue, you know, I mean, interesting enough, there has been a massive drive in doubling the capacity of production of electricity. So the capacity of electricity was about 24,000 megawatts a year. As we speak today, by the end of 2018, the capacity of production will be 50,000 megawatts. So we have actually excess energy. And to plan forward, we are quite comfortable enough that we are not going to have an issue that has to do with availability of energy, electricity, and so forth. Add to that, of course, you know, that there has been a policy of diversification of the energy resources. I mean, 3 years ago, the energy mix was almost 93% fossil fuel and 7% more or less renewable energy. By 2035, we will see a different mix of 45% renewable energies and 55% fossil fuel. It's actually being realized right now. So that was one major issue that has been detrimental to the environment, you know. Add to that, you know, the bureaucracy and the legislative reform that took place in a way impacted the industry in a negative, in a positive way. At face value, it seems to be negative when they lifted the subsidy on energy. So the energy bill on the industry almost tripled in many different ways. But it pushed the industry to become more cost efficient. So as a matter of fact, we have been complaining very much about the cheap energy because it did not give any incentive for any industry to economize. So the impact has been quite dramatic, both on the country and on the industry at large. Industries are investing more in sustainable mechanisms, in environmentally conscious industries, in recycling. So all of a sudden, a market was created for industries that did not exist before that. Recycling waste, energy efficiency, recycling water. I mean, all these issues were more of a joke at the time because they did not have any economic viabilities. Now it's become the mainstream of the Egyptian industry at large. So when we look at that and we look at the figures, you know, there is a rebound in the industrial growth. Over the last years, it's well above 10%, and it differs from one sector to the other. There are more leading sectors than others. Growth rate, you know, we suffered a decrease for 2 consecutive years of 20% in our exports and our non-oil exports. As we speak today, 2017 witnessed an 11% growth in exports. January 2018 had a 16% increase in exports. So, I mean, the trajectory seems to be moving in the right direction. So, I mean, at large, you know, from an industry perspective, we look very positively when it comes to the infrastructure at large. But add to that a very aggressive legislative reform agenda that has to do with most of the legislations that have been impeding growth in the country. When we talk about a new investment law, that more or less address several of the anomalies in the previous law. A bankruptcy law that hasn't been touched since 1998 now is in action. We have an industrial licensing law that's supposed to reduce issuing a license from 600 days down to 7 days. I would say probably more towards 30 days, but this is a big advancement. Add to that, almost 230 economically related laws have been issued in 2017. The agenda is still full for 2018, but the real challenge, again, which is currently being addressed and tackled, is digging down, deep down, and reforming the bureaucracy. So apart from the legislative agenda, we have another agenda of tackling the issues that are impeding on a sectoral basis. Every sector has its own specific anomalies and limitations, and I think the challenge is to unlock it and break down this bureaucracy in order to more or less have improved the flow of business in the country. We're seeing the returns. I mean, foreign direct investment last year increased up to 8.5 billion, up from 6 billion. We are seeing a projected increase this year, somewhere close to 10.5 billion. But there are other sectors that have been more or less catching up that have a direct impact on the industry, notably construction, which grew last year by 14%, which impacts more than 60 industries. Tourism, that rebounded by 55% last year, is also impacting more than 70 industries that are catering to the... So, I mean, in a nutshell, not to take too much longer, the prospects seem to be very promising, and we are seeing a lot of investments or reinvestment in this sector. Notably, several companies are considering Egypt as a regional production hub to re-export to the region in view of having free trade agreements with almost 1.6 billion inhabitants that are within the region that enjoy whom we enjoy a free trade agreement with. Plus, you know, the float of the pound made Egypt quite attractive to invest in terms of the cost and the availability of cheaper labor and amenities. Thank you.
Thank you. It sounds like Egypt's on the move.
It is.
In the good way.
It is.
That's awesome. I'd like, Mr. Issa, when we get to you in just a moment, I'd like to come back to the currency idea and kind of see what your take is on, from a banking perspective on this currency, the floating of the pound. But before we get to you, Ms. Sharif is a CEO and co-founder of Ahead of the Curve, involved in entrepreneurship in Egypt. As you hear Mr. Tawfik talk about this growing economy and all these positive numbers and excess energy and the currency and the legislative changes that have happened, what's the impact on the entrepreneurial world, in your opinion?
Yeah, so I think, thank you for the question. So I think just to create everything Tarek said is very positive, but just to shed light on youth unemployment in Egypt today is probably amongst the highest in the world. And if we want to see a resolution to the creation of jobs, we really need to see a bustling entrepreneurship scene, and we need to see new business growth move from the bottom up. And I think oftentimes when we talk about Egypt, we don't always tell the positive narratives, and entrepreneurship and innovation is one of the more positive narratives that are coming out of Egypt today. And over the past 10 years, I think what we've seen is a very strong ecosystem evolve. We've seen a very increase in the number of accelerators, incubators, university programs, companies like Google, Facebook coming in to create programs in collaboration with the private sector to train youth on things like mobile applications, women on how to use social media to grow their businesses. So we've seen a lot of, I think, interest in the entrepreneurship scene, but a lot of really strong efforts to see the ecosystem grow and evolve. Another interesting trend that I would say is ahead of the curve, because we like to support social entrepreneurship, impact-driven entrepreneurship, we also see a trend of new businesses in sectors like education, healthcare, transportation, and a lot of innovation in things like affordable healthcare insurance, areas that we haven't seen before, which is getting a lot of interest from foreign investors. We've seen funds like 500 startups in Silicon Valley establish a MENA-focused fund and have actually invested in businesses in Egypt. And more specifically, just because last week was International Women's Day, I think I'd be remiss if I didn't mention what is specifically happening with regards to women in Egypt. We've seen an exponential rise in women-led startups, but we've also seen a lot of focus in helping women who have already established businesses grow their businesses further through, for example, the Goldman Sachs 10,000 Women's Initiative, which is based out of the American University in Cairo. It's been cited as one of the most successful initiatives out of all of the Goldman Sachs initiatives in the world. We've seen an exponential growth in the businesses that have gone through that program, and they have gone on to create by far more jobs than anyone ever anticipated. So I think in terms of entrepreneurship and innovation, we have a very, very positive story happening. Youth and women are really starting to take control of their agency through entrepreneurship and through the creation of new businesses. And I think that's a narrative that is not told enough here in the US.
We do. We need to tell that more.
We need to tell a lot more.
That's good. Thank you.
And, you know, before Ahmed speaks, CIB has also invested in a fintech accelerator at the American University in Cairo through the American University in Cairo V-Lab. And I think they've already gone through 3 cycles of within the accelerator, and it's also doing extremely well.
And we're very proud of that.
Yeah.
Actually.
Ahmed Issa is involved in banking. Give us a story about banking. What's happening in banking in Egypt?
Well, a lot of reforms, a lot of liberalization of the market in the banking sector. In November 2016, the Central Bank of Egypt took a very courageous move to liberalize the currency market and allowed the Egyptian pound to free float. We've seen over the past months since that policy change happened, currency flow back into the system, into the official systems. Again, we've seen all the backlogs and the long waits with the Egyptian business community basically evaporate. We've seen as well recently, very interestingly, the foreign investors, foreign financial investors who invested in Egyptian financial securities use the interbank market despite the fact that they have access to something called the repatriation window, which is basically a window where the central bank helps or guarantees to the foreign investor access to the foreign currency. So foreign investors have found, even despite the fact that they have access to foreign currency availed by the Central Bank of Egypt, they didn't need to resort to that window and resorted to the normal interbank market in Egypt. We're seeing as well a very conservative central bank, a very conservative banking system. It's probably one of the safest in the whole world. If you think that the capital adequacy ratios, which is a very important, I don't know how many bankers are in the room, but capital adequacy ratio is probably the main standard for measuring the riskiness of bank balance sheets across different markets. Egypt has one of the highest capital adequacy ratios in the whole world. And if you think of a standard like IFRS 9, International Financial Recording System Standard number 9, which is again a very conservative standard for accounting for investments and accounting for balance sheet risks. In Egyptian banking sector this year, the Central Bank of Egypt is going to adopt IFRS 9. So I think the Egyptian banking sector is at the forefront of global safety of banking systems. It's certainly one of the most liquid in the whole world, and it offers a great, I guess we can say that there's a lot of dry powder available in the banking sector in Egypt to fund the potential rise of demand for borrowing to fund the next wave of growth in the Egyptian economy. I'll probably close with one very interesting remark. A lot of people from around the world don't appreciate the fact that the Egyptian banking sector has actually more than 3 trillion Egyptian pounds of deposits across the 39 banks. That's very close to almost 100% of GDP. It says that to what extent Egyptians trust their banking system and at the same time have the ability to save with the banking sector in Egypt. So which is a very, very important, I guess, catalyst for funding future growth. So I guess the banking sector is liquid and ready to fund growth. That's the key message.
Sounds great, all the way across the board.
It is.
What keeps you up at night?
Well, that's always a very interesting question to.
I didn't mean to set you up.
Yeah, yeah. Well, but you did.
We can move on. We can move on.
No, seriously, as any market, as any banking market, Egypt we still need to see capital formation rise. I refer back to the point that my colleagues have mentioned. Egypt there are about 1 million Egyptians who turn 21 each year, and that number is going to rise going forward. And with that comes maybe 3/4 to 1 million each year who demand jobs. And for that to happen, capital formation in the country needs to rise to much higher levels than the levels that we're seeing right now. I think we need to see the private sector in Egypt take more activity in building factories, in building roads, or building basically the capital assets of the country to create sustainable jobs. That's probably the biggest challenge that I see. I think all the other challenges are being tackled. If you look at the government budget deficit, it's in the right direction. The current account is also in the right direction. I think everybody agrees in Egypt that the reform program, whether at the fiscal side or at the monetary policy or the monetary side, is in place and is working and is leading to results, concrete results. So I don't want to sound too optimistic. It's always these things are dangerous, but the truth is it's a very good situation to have.
Yeah, that's good. I think that leads us into a good segue, right?
Yes, I'm happy with the things that keep you up at night.
That leads us to Tamer Younes. He's the chair of AmCham in Egypt, works in Corporate Sustainability and Responsibility Committee, and he's a member of the board and the head of corporate affairs for North Africa and the Levant in Procter and Gamble.
Yes.
That's what it says. That's awesome.
Is it so? Okay.
That's what it says.
Too
That's
much.
what you are.
Yeah.
I think the transition or the good lead-in goes from the banking sector and all the things that keep us up at night to how do multinationals engage in this private sector Egypt growth and economy? Tell us a little bit about that.
Okay. Thank you for your question. Thank you for the opportunity. Well, multinationals in general, the way we operate is that I'll talk about the sector that we operate in primarily is you cannot ship diapers, for example, long distance from the US to consumers around the world, or you cannot ship shampoos, water over water. Doesn't make sense. So you gotta be very close to consumers. That's why we have plants. You cannot either also have a plant in every country that you operate. So you strategically select hubs and where you'll establish the base of your operation. You reach out with these products or services to the region. Some countries choose Dubai. Some companies choose the Gulf. Some companies choose Egypt. We were one of the companies that chose Egypt for all the good reasons. Apart from the location, of course, that Egypt enjoys geographically. Egypt has an abundance of trade agreements with the Arab world, Africa, Europe, lots of bilaterals, and we certainly hope to see Egypt and the US having FTA at a certain point in time. It's very important, and we think it's way overdue. In terms of cost, despite the rising cost due to energy and subsidy lift across the country, Egypt still is very competitive, a place to operate. The energy cost, the cost of labor, and the cost of even the price of land. Once you have access to land, I mean, the price of land is affordable. In terms of talent, Egypt has a great pool of talent. So as a company, we are a net exporter of talent. We have 99.9% Egyptians in our operations in Egypt. And we also have exported, so we have 40 Egyptians in leading management roles in P&G globally. And that's a testimony to the real, pure talent that Egypt has. There's also a benefit of good and easy access to government. So, today you can reach a minister over a phone and actually explain an issue that you have. You can easily get an appointment and go meet. Of course, there'll be certain exceptions, but the vast majority you have access to most people, and it's easy to talk to them. It's easy to explain your challenges. Most of the ministers have good business background. They can really talk the same language and understand where you're coming from. of course, last but not least, the consumer base. Egypt is 100 million people. The entire Arab belt has over 1,600,000. I mean, it's a good place to be and get your products or services across to the people. The instability in the region has caused us some turbulence. Like I said, being a hub means that you need to get your product across borders to other countries. Syria went off the map a few years ago. When you have a instability in Iraq, for example, Kurdistan splitting or not, that delays access to product to the markets, Libya and whatnot. So that requires you to have strike a good balance between the local demand and the demand from importing countries around. But again, we are a strong believer of the future of Egypt, and we are there for the longer term, despite some turbulence every now and then. But again, the country is on the right track, and we believe in the future of Egypt.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Before we open it up to questions and answers, what I'd like to do is just ask you a question that if you were in your respected arena, if you were able to, see one specific goal that you'd like to focus on in the next year or 5 years, what would you like to see happen? What would you like to see happen in industry?
Well, actually, we painted a very rosy picture, but the devil is in the details, So, I mean, still doing business Egypt is not an easy job, I mean, we have been plagued with almost 40 or 50 years of decadence and bureaucracy.
Yeah.
So there has been an accumulation of problems and red tape across the board. What we're talking about as we speak today is that there has been, a change in the mindset of the country in opening up and reforming at an accelerated pace that we have never witnessed before. The reform agenda that took place over the last couple of years by far is multiples of what we ever aspired to as a business community. So what we're focusing on for the coming year is the second wave of reform. So we just hit the tip of the iceberg. We need to go and dig deeper on a sectoral level. So without tackling the bureaucracy and the red tape, we're not going to be exploiting the real potential of the country. We'll be growing, we'll be doing good, but not to the extent of really putting Egypt as a star in the region. And we have all what it takes to become a star. All the studies that had been done by Citigroup, by HSBC, by you name it, identifies Egypt as having the potential of becoming one of the top 20 economies by 2050. So the potential is there, the ingredients are there, the homework to get us there is yet to be done.
That's good.
So that is what we should be focusing on in the few years to come. Just tackling the bureaucracy, breaking down the red tape, having a more transparent system. We have an opportune moment that, that hasn't happened in quite some time, that you have a reformist government, a reformist president, and the prime priority of us, is to have security and economic prosperity. And I think it could be done.
Very good. Thank you. What about you, Dina? What would be a wave of magic wand? What would you like to see?
Couple of unicorns coming out of Egypt. 2 or 3 maybe. No. Yes, that for sure. But I think for me, I think everyone at this table, we do what we do because we want to see a sustainable and inclusive Egypt, and we want to see all of our youth employed, and we want them to transition to adulthood and lead dignified, healthy lives, and we want to see Egypt be a hub. So I think in terms of my own work, I would love to see Egypt really be a hub for innovation and become a leading exporter of innovation. So I would love to see more investors from Silicon Valley, from Boston, from all around the world come shopping for innovation in our country, and I do see that potential. And I think it can happen with the right focus and investment, and I would love to see women play a leading role in this. And I think across our region, a story that is never told is that in terms of tech entrepreneurship, women are at the forefront of that. And as opposed to, the picture that people in the West have that women are not involved in tech, in GCC and also in Egypt, we see a lot more women creating tech enterprises actually than here in the US. So I think that there are some interesting stories here that I would love to see roll out and evolve and really see Egypt turn into a true hub for innovation and really tackle innovation in sectors like healthcare and education that could be useful around the world.
Very good, very good. Ahmed, what do you think? What would you like to see happen in the banking industry?
More loans to women.
We're very proud of the work that we're doing on low-income mortgages and enabling Egyptians start to rise up the property ladder. And we're very proud of what the rest of the industry, and definitely CIB at the forefront of that, is working on the digital migration of the Egyptian banking system. This is going to lead to very big shifts in the efficiencies, and it's going to allow us to reduce the marginal cost to serve the next million customers for each bank. CIB has a plan to double its customer base over the coming few years. And while we're doing that, we're also reducing the cost to serve and the cost to acquire customers through digital innovation and through investments in IT infrastructure. But the key thing that is also going to happen is that what I really wish is that the industry in general would recognize the global multinationals would realize to what extent Egypt offers risk-adjusted returns. Egypt has one of the best risk-adjusted returns in the whole world, in my opinion. And I haven't, in my 25 years of banking career, I haven't seen a single multinational leave Egypt because they were not happy with the returns in Egypt or with bureaucracy or with, those that have left, that I have seen leave, left because of maybe a global strategy to reduce emerging market or any other reason. And they would probably have been a bit sad that they are leaving Egypt. We just acquired Citibank business in Egypt, retail banking business in Egypt a couple of years ago. And Citi was realizing returns in Egypt that is higher than the rest of their network all across the world. And so what I'd like to probably see is that the banking sector in Egypt benefit from this increased realization, I guess brand awareness from across the world. If that happens, I think we're all going to be in much better shape.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you. Tamer, what do you think? What would you like to see happen in the multinational world in Egypt?
Okay, I'd like to see two things. Building on what Tarek said about, we mentioned a couple of positive points. One thing that we would want to see improving is that the reduction of the amount of red tape or the bureaucracy that we see within some execution at certain government levels. The problem is we as companies have gotten accustomed to this now, so it's becoming an integral part of the cost of doing business, which is making it a bit higher than it should be. Ideally, if we take it for granted. I mean, you know that you're going to finish this process is going to take you steps 1 through 4, while you don't necessarily need 2 and 3. It could be 1 and 4 only, but it's just the cost of doing business. I mean, it will be best for us and best for the consumer eventually. We want to see reduction in that. One other thing is that the integration. There needs to be sort of a godfather figure that tells businesses, if you're sourcing these materials from outside of Egypt, these are the local alternatives, for example, and we can help you source those materials, or we can connect businesses together in a way. The Federation is doing a great job on that front, and I think there could be more done on from a government level as well.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you guys very much. I appreciate your insights on what's going on in various sectors. So now let's just take a few minutes. If you have any questions, we've got a microphone or two there in the back. If you got a question, just raise your hand. We'll have a microphone to you. And please address one of our panelists, and they'll answer in kind.
Dave Ottaway from the Woodrow Wilson Center. A few weeks back, there was an announcement that there were going to be 10 IPOs this year from one ministry. And a couple of weeks later, another ministry said, no, we're not doing IPOs. So what is the government policy, as you read it, regarding the privatization of state companies?
I can talk about that. No, as a matter of fact, the public sector minister who has been there for a year and a half was dismissed. And a new minister who comes from the banking sector is in charge. And now you have listings of 10 IPOs in line to be issued this year. So the mindset of the country is to at least semi-privatize. And there are two other significant bits of news, which is the Gas Act that opened the gas sector, which was totally monopolized by the government, to the private sector, whereby you can go, produce, sell, import, and deal directly with businesses outside the government grid. This is a game changer, big time. And it will have implications on the gas deal with Israel. It's opening up a whole frontier of businesses and services that we haven't seen in the last 60 years. Add to that another sector that was totally monopolized by the government, which is the railway sector. Now with the new Railway Act, it's opening up for private investment to go in. So the mindset really is to offload a big chunk of these businesses from the public sector to the private sector. And we are confident enough that we're going to see quite a bit of momentum in 2018. I hope it answers your question.
Well, I just saw these conflicting statements about whether you were going to go ahead with the IPOs or not.
No, it is going ahead. Well, within the coming few weeks, you will see you'll see the news coming in,
Thank you, Dave. Another question?
Hi, Adam Drucker from Ancora Consulting. So the immediate news after the floating of the currency, although in the long term it has stabilized, I think, the currency reserves in the country, as well as creating more of a GDP growth, the immediate effect was that poorer Egyptians had a harder time accessing necessities like food. So one of you spoke about trying to improve economic distribution, and in what way has the private sector reforms allowed for the better distribution of the economic growth to improve maybe a consumer economy in Egypt?
Anybody want to take that?
Go ahead. I'll comment on it
Probably,
later.
yeah. Usually, with any country that sees rise in inflation rates, there usually comes shifts in wealth, and that's natural. But that was a reform program. We all have to understand that. And it was a necessary reform program, and it was a very courageous one, and it had to happen. So I think the country is dealing very, very well with all the consequences of that right policy that has to happen. As a matter of fact, I think everybody's impressed with how the Egyptian people have handled the reforms and the consequences of the reforms. Egyptians understand what needs to be done, and I think they are fully supportive from what we're seeing. Most of the companies that I talk to at the AmCham or in my line of business will tell you that they've seen their volumes decline in the few months after the reform started. But then sometime around, every one of them will tell you that actually around June to October, volumes started to pick up again. So we're seeing a rebound in the economic activities in general. It's probably a U-shaped recovery, and we're probably a year into the lower part of the U. But I think overall, the results are actually very positive. Most of the companies that I deal with have seen rises in profitability this year, and at the same time, the Egyptian people, the low-income Egyptians, are also we're not seeing any declines in the quality of credit at the bank, so overall things are going well in general.
And building on this, just to your point, companies' role as well is to provide consumers with products that meet their need at any entry or any price point. So you'll find a tiered program. So there is a premium diapers, for example, and there is a mid-tier and lower tier, so that you can provide the needs for the consumer at any price point. post the devaluation immediately, it was kind of a shock to the consumer. So it took a bit of a while to readjust the purse and how much they can afford. But again, your role is to be there for them and provide them with the product that they will need to sustain a stable life as well.
Yeah, can I?
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay.
Comment,
Are you sure?
no, I'll come to after you.
Okay, just to build on Tamer's point, I think the private sector as a whole is thinking very carefully about how to be more inclusive in the way they grow their businesses, and I think how they include the base of the pyramid across their value chain is something that they're being very mindful of as either producers or consumers, and also thinking very carefully about how to integrate smaller local businesses within their supply chains to create more wealth at the base is something that the private sector is thinking about. But in addition to that, because I know that that's probably not suffice when it comes to poverty, we do have a very, our Minister of Social Solidarity has been working very, very hard to create a proper safety net, and she has built in collaboration with the World Bank a very successful cash transfer program to ensure that we don't see increased poverty levels. And then the Egyptian philanthropic sector and the philanthropic arms of our private sector, I think, have really stepped up to ensure that poverty doesn't increase in significant amounts, and that it's actually whatever is needed in terms of cash transfers and basic products and services are delivered to the poor.
It just didn't go without hardship, let me put it this way.
Yeah.
But I mean, what Dina is saying, there is a program that is covering 2 million families that are run by almost 90% single women with a conditional cash transfer. And this was a targeted approach, to tackle the poorest of the poor. So that is one program that went very successfully, will ultimately result into reaching out almost 3.2 million families within a couple of years. Add to that, that the ration cards are covering 65 million Egyptians, and they included a cash portion in it to avail cash for the Egyptian consumers to give them a better choice rather than restrict them into an in-kind products that were available on these ration cards. Employment when it comes to the private sector. Over the last 4 years, we almost increased our salaries by over 100%. I mean, it's not a contribution, it is a necessity. You had to react. The pensioners already had an accelerated increase in their pensions over the last 3 years. Add to that several sectors in the economy have benefited from the float, like the agricultural sector, which more or less employs 30% of the population. The price of commodities almost quadrupled. So as far as the increase in the cost, it was more or less compensated by a higher return for their crops. So when we talk about the poverty level, what has been going on has been more or less mapping, identification, and addressing pockets of poverty, because you cannot generalize. Several sectors really flourished over the last year and a half after the float.
That help, Mr. Drucker? Very good. Let's have one or maybe two more.
Thank you, Andy. Edward Joseph, National Council on U.S.-Libya Relations. Of course, I'll accept any comments any of you would like to make on your neighbor. But let me ask you a question. All of you have shared the impressive progress related to Libya's business environment, including on the inclusive aspect of it. Let me, if I could, turn you to a wider challenge that Egypt faces, as your neighbors also face, and that's with water supply. And I just would like your comments from the private sector as to how you see the country addressing this challenge, and whether you see it imposing a constraint on the impressive economic growth that Egypt has experienced. Thank you.
Can talk water?
I will talk water, but you guys. Well, anyway, water, just let me give you some figures, 70% of our water is used in agriculture, in irrigation, with an efficiency of 50%. We have a wastage rate of about 20 to 25% in our crops. So our our efficiency of utilizing water is somewhere around 40 to 35%, you know. So modernizing our irrigation system and modernizing our supply chain and cold chain, which is already happening, but it's going to take some time, will contribute enough water to double our agricultural area. So, I mean, the potential is there. When you use modern irrigation system, the efficiency of usage of water is 90% versus the 50% that we are already having. When you have the wastage cut from 25% down to the 4 or 5%, which is an international standard, this just shows you where the opportunity and the potential is. Right now, there are several programs that whereby rather than pumping fresh water to the coastal areas, we are constructing desalination plants. And this is a big issue. It doesn't make any sense to pump subsidized water from the Nile to the coastal areas. So this is already well on track. A couple of days ago, there was a decree in Cairo, you know, to penalize those who misuse the water in cleaning their cars and cleaning the street, you know. There is quite a drive, an apprehension when it comes to our usage of water. Water has been historically, for the mindset of Egyptians, a God-given right, free. So, I mean, in this respect, the abuse of usage of water was inherent with our attitudes and culture. Now that water has a price to pay, and this has been a landmark in having a premium on the water, water right now costs you more than gasoline, whether that has to be in the industrial areas or in the household usage. Once the minute you start paying a price for water, this is when you start rationalizing. So the attitude of consumption is dramatically changing, and I think they're moving in the right direction when it comes to that.
That answer, Mr. Joseph? Very good. Let's have one more. We'll have one more question down here in front, and then we'll need to close up because our panel will need to leave.
My name is Salah Hassan. I'm a professor of strategic brand management at George Washington University, a neighboring school. I would like to welcome you. Very incredible story. Thank you for sharing it with us. As I hear you in talking about public sector reform, the role of the entrepreneurship in building the future of Egypt, the banking industry reform, the role of multinationals, you have an incredible, powerful story to tell, and I believe that your visit is definitely part of that storytelling. My question is two sides. First of all, what are you trying to achieve from this visit, and what makes this visit rather unique from previous visits? And the other side of my question, how can you take that incredible storytelling as part of an approach of building Egypt as the rebranding of Egypt, if you will? What is the role of the private sector in rebranding Egypt?
A great question.
I guess, Atida, what are we trying to do here?
I just want to comment, you know, I wouldn't have been sitting here confidently talking a year and a half ago. As a matter of fact, a year and a half ago in September, we as a business community were extremely skeptical that anything will happen. Now that we are here, you know, we have a story to tell that we were not able to communicate a year ago. And we are quite impressed with what's happened, and we are part of it. So this is the difference between then and now. And honestly, as a business community, we just present raw facts. When things are bad, we say it's bad. When things are good, we say it's good, for the benefit of the economy and for growth, you know, and prosperity. Branding Egypt, I have to admit that Egypt at large is very bad in communicating and branding. We have the best stories to tell, and we are getting the worst coverage, notably here in the United States. It's an uphill fight, you know, and we have to improve our communication. I mean, a visit as our visit today, which is done on a yearly basis, is a drop in the bucket. It makes an impact, but we need to have better one-on-one communications with all different circles. As a private sector, we're doing our part, but we are actually trying to communicate and collaborate with the government to have a more orchestrated coverage in this respect. And then the whole idea of marketing Egypt and branding it probably requires some expert advice in this direction.
May I follow up?
Please.
I thank you very much for really admitting that we have a brand challenge. We do have a brand challenge. And I believe we do have a viable solution. If you look at the Mexico experience, if you look at the South Africa experience, if you look at the Dubai experience, not too far away, and how they have done a lot with little. We have a lot, but we are doing very little with it. And I believe that all these success stories from the countries that I mentioned have a national branding board. Egypt is the only country that have a tremendous resources, 2/3 of the world artifacts, major deposits in the banking system, incredible hub for multinationals, very innovative youth that are promising. Why aren't we having a national branding board? Very much like Dubai, very much like Mexico, very much like Australia, very much like Brand USA, and so forth. What is the role? And I really would like to engage with you individually on, really, I believe AmCham does have a leadership role to play in at least playing the trigger of the establishment of such a national branding board that can be under the auspices of the president of Egypt, as in the case of Mexico. It is directly under the auspices of the president of Mexico. He's the champion of the nation brand, but you are empowering that, fueling that, and moving it in the right direction. I really believe you have an incredible story to tell, and I believe we need to put synergies around that, and we need to rally private sector support to empower the establishment of the first national branding board to help investment, to help manufacturing, to help export, to help tourism, to have a unified brand image for Egypt. That's my message. Thank you.
Please.
I think everything you're saying is extremely valid, and narratives matter. And I think AmCham has worked really hard to provide a different narrative for Egypt, but that's also a two-way street. So I think here in the US, and I can say this comfortably because I'm also American and I'm a fellow at Harvard, and we tend to only tell a very particular narrative that serves the interests of this country. And we can flood the positive narrative all we want, but it also takes a little bit of willingness from academic institutions, from private sector here, from the US government, to really open up their eyes and see a different narrative. But it's also, it's extremely hard when you sit in a room and you say, by the way, there's another narrative. That's interesting. We want to focus on this narrative. It's a two-way street, and I think us being here is extremely important. But I would also say there is a responsibility for everyone in this room, for everyone we meet with, to go and spread that positive story as well. And every country, there is no country that is perfect. There is no country in the world that just has one positive narrative. Egypt is not perfect, but it's trying extremely hard. There are exceptional, wonderful examples, like you say, of youth and business leaders, and the government is really on a path of very positive reform. But the United States has to be willing to listen to another narrative as well, and not constantly stick to one narrow frame that serves the interests of a very narrow group of people. And I think universities can play a big role in that. I think government officials policymakers can play a big role in that. And I think think tanks here in DC can play an enormous role in that. And we're also not seeing enough, will to move in that other direction as well as we have in other countries.
I'd like to comment on that issue again. We didn't have a narrative, like I mentioned, about a couple of years ago. Now something is cooking, It's an uphill fight. But I believe that engaging, our perspective is engaging into reforming the economy, reforming the country, focusing on our employment growth rates, will put Egypt into relevance. Mm-hmm. We are not relevant as we speak today, but being relevant will impose our story on the different stakeholders. And I think the focus on the short run is to make Egypt relevant from within. And this is how we see it work.
Very good. If we, Mr. Hassan, that it's a great comment. And in fact, I can speak in terms of the House of Representatives. That conversation is happening a lot for people who want to serve Egypt and want to elevate this branding conversation. There's a lot of talk going on right now. It's just really interesting that you say that. 20 seconds for closing remarks. Do you guys want to say anything in particular? Say
I just want to add one thing,
20 seconds.
Yeah. Industry and business we have a new business model. The old business model, pre-float, is not functioning. And this is where companies suffered. So, I mean, having a business model that is set on industry, on focusing on expanding our reach within the country, on exports, is very much different than the model that was prevailing, which was basically trading. Those who are engaged into industrial development are going to flourish, like we've seen in the last year. Those who are engaged into a decadent business model are not, it's gone forever. So
Good.
that's my take.
Yeah. Nina, closing statement?
I think I would have to borrow a famous Ahmed Isa line, which is, things may not be perfect, but Egypt is open for business, and everyone should come and see for themselves what's happening.
Like that.
Well, Egypt is the 28th largest economy in the world by household consumption. And if you probably add unofficial economy, the ranking is even better than that. And returns are remarkable. And the rhetoric here in Washington, D.C. is making it difficult for corporate headquarters to listen to their guys on the ground in Egypt. The narrative, the brand, you may call it as we can call it, but I think people who are not investing in Egypt today are missing a lot of opportunities.
Very good.
Well, as an American company, I think one of the best decisions that we made is what we just chose Egypt to invest in it. As an Egyptian working in an American company, I think the best use of my time is to come here to Washington this week, to talk about Egypt passionately and, say how much we believe in the country.
Thank you all very much. Thank you for CTR. Thanks for the Institute of Conflict Management. Thanks for our distinguished panel here. Thank you guys for being here
Thank
to
you.
talk to us about Egypt. Could you give us a hand? All of them. Thank you very much. You are dismissed. Thank you guys. Pleasure. I'd love to have this conversation more in